So what happens, I guess, when you percent I'm sure everybody hates my guts now too. It's a common problem.
It's good. I mean, to get people here, so that's the important thing.
I think if we start to really ingrain it, it'll be good. And I've got the atmospheric folks there. We're cross-posting each other now, so hopefully we'll get some of their students. Hi.
Okay.
Ooh, this is not good.
So another 5 minutes while
Absolutely.
work out technical.
The talk's only an hour and a half, so.
Yes, it's a call. It just doesn't.
Good, are you?
You're thinking of it, right? And so there's.
No, I just need to figure out how to flip the camera.
All the grants are doing, I can go back. I just think you're right. Like one slide at the very end. And I have an edit that's always all really like. And then I did one grant this past year and they just. So I have, so in the first of January, I have to submit an annual report of what I did. And Microsoft first grant and ask for it. But it's so much time. Spend this time. I guess that's really true. I need to look at
Organisms what they do. So I know we were in the meeting, but kicking in.
exactly right. The problem is that this is the small enough that yeah, like
This is your people's fault.
My people's fault?
Yeah, but no.
Oh, yeah.
I'm just.
Got it going?
It's fine. I'm just worried. I just want to make sure that we have 3 viewers, and I'm seeing if so it's mirrored on my screen, and I think they do that because they're used to looking at yourself, so they want you to see like the mirror version of yourself. But they broadcast it normal. I just saw it, but I was just checking to make sure.
do you want me to log on?
Is there a little chat room or something there?
Yeah, I can log on with another account probably.
It's so painful because you read this and they talk about it.
Everybody's, I think it's fine to be honest with you. So you can get started. I did.
Yeah.
I mean, you're in.
Reading this. That's great. They did remote sensing. I mean, now you
Let me know when you're ready.
I'm ready.
Okay. All right, everyone, we're going to get started. I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker today, Dr. David Yoskowitz. David is the Endowed Chair for Socioeconomics at the Hart Research Institute for Gulf of Mexico Studies at Texas A&M Corpus Christi. We first met in 2001 at a Coastal Estuarine Research Federation conference when David came blasting past me during the fun run as we stomped through waist-high sargassum. He was very encouraging in his trouncing of my race time there. And we've remained contacted ever since then. David received his BS in economics from Bentley College and an MA and PhD in economics from Texas Tech University, where he claims he has picked up no Texas accent from, and we can evaluate that today. And joined Texas A&M recently after receiving his degree. He is taught at A&M in the College of Business, College of Science and Engineering, and has been with the Hart Institute for the last, since 2008. He has an impressive publication record. I'm not going to go through this record here because it would take up all of his time, but this impressive record is only trumped by his record of service to local organizations, national policy issues, and of course scientific communities, including SURF. He's used his expertise in environmental economics to better connect coastal communities, stakeholders, and marine economies to functioning ecosystems, and that's what he's here to talk to us today. We're lucky that he is a local for at least the next year or so, in that he's serving a term as the chief economist for NOAA, and today he's going to talk to us about moving ecosystem services from practice to policy, bridging the Great Divide. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Yoskowitz.
Thank you. Thank you. I don't know how you want to run this, if you want to have questions during or save questions for the end.
The end is pretty customary, but if you're
okay, no, let's
with...
do that so we know when we can get to the end. And then we can, do I need to be closer to there?
You're fine.
Okay.
I'll follow you.
All right. So just as a caveat, I've only been at NOAA for about 3.5 months. So, I'm still coming up to speed on the inner workings and all the policy issues. So if there's something very specific down in the weeds that you're going to ask me about, what is NOAA doing on this, I may or may not have an answer to that. But I thought this was a great opportunity to take what I do in my academic role and try to bridge it to now what is my role at NOAA, and that is more in the policy realm, and see if there's space for that to happen, especially in ecosystem services. So most of this, what I'm going to present today, revolves around the coastal zone, marine resources, but not very much on the terrestrial environment. So just letting you know that ahead of time. So I'm wearing 2 hats today. So as I said, I'm going to be wearing my HRI or academic hat and my NOAA hat. I actually don't have these hats in person, so I have them here virtually. And Layla and I were talking about this on the drive up, and it is a big commitment to kind of pull away from someplace for a year, uproot your family, and start in a whole new environment. But I think the benefit is, especially for me in working as an economist and in the area of ecosystem services, is having that work applied to a policy or management issue, and seeing how that policy or management decisions are made at the federal level is very beneficial as I return back to that academic and institute environment. And just a little bit of background about what the Hart Research Institute is. It's built around 6 endowed chairs ranging from the natural sciences to the social sciences and policy. So not unlike what you have in your department here. With the mission that by Ed Hart was simply to make a difference. Now there's a lot of space in there to make a difference, but the idea was to bring the science and have that science move to action. And so, coming from the Hart Research Institute and moving to NOAA to make that a lot of what we do actionable is a great opportunity. So first, just to make sure that we're all on the same page, and I do this whenever I'm talking about ecosystem services, what do we actually mean by that? Because people use these 2 words in very different ways. So I just wanted to start us all off on the same playing field about what we're talking. And quite simply, ecosystem services are the benefits that we receive from our natural environment that impacts our human well-being. It's no more complicated than that. Sometimes individuals do make it more complicated than that. What I can tell you that it is not, is we're not talking about ecological function. So an example here, it's not what one habitat, how it benefits another. How oysters clear up the water, and that makes it better for conditions for seagrass, because now you have water clarity, you have much better light penetration. That's really important, don't get me wrong, but that's not an ecosystem service. That's an ecological function. Okay, biophysical functioning on the oyster side leads to that ecological functioning, which makes it better for the seagrass. So why even, from my perspective, why even get into this realm of ecosystem service? Well, for one thing, it's a real nice lens in bringing the biophysical to the impact on human well-being. So looking through that lens of ecosystem service allows us to do that. And quite frankly, it's driven by that decisions are incomplete and inefficient if they don't include all benefits and costs. So for most of the resource management decisions that we make, even up to today, even though we have a recognition of the importance of ecosystem services, the measurement of those services as a benefit to humans is still not included in a lot of the management decisions. So we're making decisions with incomplete information. And so the idea of ecosystem services is to kind of fill out that information to make more complete and efficient decisions. So that's what motivates my work, is to begin to fill those gaps. So I think you really have made it when the field that you're working in actually gets into the funnies or the cartoon. So many of you are probably familiar with Sherman's Lagoon. If you're not, Jim Toomey's from Annapolis. You know, his characters are critters that are under the water. Sherman is a shark. Hawthorne is this hermit crab. And so I'll just kind of read this off. My bill. Your bill for what? Ecosystem services. Huh? What's that? Crabs play a vital role in the environmental health of this planet. Yeah, so? Yeah, it's about time we started charging for it. Come on, get with it, Sherman. If you're not charging for ecosystem services, you're nobody. My ecosystem services. Yeah, what do you do besides sit there all day? And he has some outgassing and make little methane bubbles. Renewable energy. So Jim Toomey is very much an advocate for our oceans and coasts, and he picked up on this idea of ecosystem services and has kind of carried it through a lot of the work that he has done. So just a kind of a background on economics, where it's come from in terms of environment, natural resource, and now where it's going with regards to ecosystem services. So for the longest time, we thought, that we're kind of separate. Humans are separate from their environment. This was kind of the what was the dogma within natural resource economics. That really what it is it's just usually some input into an economic process. So we take out coal, we take out iron ore, we take out timber. We make something from that, right? So the environment is an input into some economic process, and then when we return to the environment is a waste stream, right? So we return to the environment is something of lower quality. So for a long time, in environmental natural resources, economic, this is how we thought of our environment. It really wasn't actually thinking of environment, it was just thinking of natural resources. Well, we know this not to be the case at all. We know that we're not separate from the ecosystem, but we're very much part of that. And this is not talking amongst environmental scientists and those that work in the policy arena in this department, that's understood. But this is not a trivial concept if you're thinking about most of my colleagues in economics, or even in the other social sciences, a number of the social sciences. Coming to grips with that, we're very much part of the ecosystem, we're affected by it, we affect the ecosystem. That's a big leap in many cases. Okay? It was a big leap for me. I cut my teeth in graduate school looking at water markets and allocation mechanisms. So I was looking at water as an input into some economic process. I wasn't really thinking about the connection of water to the environment and how the environment impacts our human well-being. It wasn't until I started working with biophysical scientists, the natural scientists, that really kind of turned me around on that in the way I think. So as we talked about a little bit already, we receive these numerous services from the environment, from our natural systems, but many of those are not accounted for through what the economists would call the market, right? A lot of these benefits that we receive fall outside traditional measures of benefit. Okay? The way that we measure the economy is towards traditional economic processes. It's not towards measuring the benefits that we receive from our natural environment. So now we have to have this change. We have to be thinking about these non-market services, which are no less valuable, and in fact, in many cases, more valuable than the marketable services. So just a little bit of background on the ecosystem services, where it was about 10 years ago and where we are today. So many of you may be familiar with the Millennium Ecosystem Service Assessment, excuse me. And out of that work came these these 4 broad categories of ecosystem services: the supportive services, the regulating services, the provisioning services, and the cultural services. And then you can see, I'm not going to name all of them off, but then you can see all the at that time, the very specific services within those broad categories. And so this was state of the art back in 2005 in terms of our thinking. It's evolved much since that time. In fact, the idea is that, not to have these 24 different services that we're supposed to be able to measure from the 4 traditional categories, because, let me just go back for a moment, how do you connect somebody directly with a hydrological cycle with net primary production? I mean, people are so far removed from that. Us in here, kind of speaking, to the choir, we understand those connections, but there are, to our neighbor, really no direct connections that we can easily measure. So the thinking has been, and rightly so, that we need to move away from these 4 broad categories, these 24 or so ecosystem services, and now be measuring something that's more final or direct. Okay? Final or direct ecosystem services. So what are those things that really connect people to the environment that impacts their human well-being? So there's been a lot of effort in this over the last 4 to 5 years. And one that I want to share with you today that I had nothing to do with, I didn't work on at all, that's a product of the EPA, was this idea of this final ecosystem goods and services classification system. So they went through the tremendous effort of developing a classification system for ecosystem services, what they're calling final ecosystem services. So those services, goods and services that most directly connect with people, they went through the process of creating a whole classification system that is very similar to, if anybody would know this, the North American Industrial Classification System. So how we measure the products, the goods and services produced in the market economy, that's the analog for this, right? To be able to classify ecosystem services in the non-market economy, more or less. And so it was a tremendous effort. And I'm not going to go into the details here. You can Google this and find this very easily. But they wanted focused definitions that tied very much to the measures of biophysical features, right? So we had to identify what the feature was: seagrass beds, oyster reefs, whatever it might be. We only wanted to count direct interactions. Okay, so not the intermediary steps. So primary production, more like a supportive or intermediate step. That's not what we wanted to count. What we wanted to count is fish caught from a day of recreational fishing. That's the kind of things that we want to count. So that was really important for economic valuation. And remember, I started the talk with this idea that we want to include all benefits and costs. Well, we need to be able to calculate those benefits through economic tools, economic valuation approaches. And so the FEGS system helped us begin to do that. Basically says this is how we shall look at ecosystem services. Now, it's not, it's not a law. We don't have to take that, but it's the best that has come along since the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. It's really going to, in my mind, could change how we deal with ecosystem services, making it a lot easier. And then finally, relates clearly to the human beneficiaries and human well-being. And that's where we want to get to. We want to connect the biophysical features to how it impacts human well-being. And what's that chain that needs to take place, chain of action that needs to take place. So the way I look at this is 3 ways, and I kind of call this an IQV plus A. So I actually added on the A today. So it's really identifying, quantify, and then value ecosystem services. So that's the IQV. So what do we mean by identify? So what are the particular ecosystem services attached to a particular habitat or biophysical geo-environment, however you want to characterize it? Is there demand for those potential ecosystem services? I'll dig into that a little bit in a moment. And what is the quality of the ecosystem service? So let me start with that first one. In a lot of cases, before we even get down to this step of valuing ecosystem service, it would be a big step and make a big impact if we could just identify ecosystem services attached to a particular habitat and then be able to connect that to human well-being. Let's not even think about the valuing or the quantifying yet, but just saying, in this stand of protected area, whether it be terrestrial, marine, whatever it might be, these are the services that we think could exist that could impact human well-being. Just going through that exercise would be a tremendous step in a lot of cases. Okay. Quantifying ecosystem services. So this is really the biophysical measurements, right? Okay, how many grams of nitrogen removed? How many pounds of fish caught, etc. The biophysical measurements are not equally more important than any of the economic valuation work that I would do, because I can't do good economic valuation work without having really good biophysical data models backing that up, right? Helping me to put forward the best case in terms of economic models. And then finally, evaluation of ecosystem services. The big question for us is, do we measure them in monetary terms, dollars, pesos, euros, whatever, or in non-monetary terms? And I'll talk about a little bit about that in just a moment. And finally, the A for today is applying ecosystem service. So what is the management or policy decision that ecosystem services can inform? Because at the end of the day, at least for me, that's where I would like to take it. It's not enough just to run through the IQV. It's now, what impact is it going to have? So I apologize for this. A little bit of, economics of ecosystem services 101, demand and supply. Just as a note here, the demand and supply curves that I draw out have necessarily no relation to reality at all. So it's just for illustrative purposes a little bit. So the demand for ecosystem services. There are no ecosystem services without demand for them. There are no ecosystem services without demand for them. So ecosystem services, by their definition, are anthropocentric. Right? There's always the potential for the supply, but if they're not demanded, then the service or the good doesn't exist. So let me give an example of that. Kennedy County, which is south of where I live in Texas, along the coast of Texas, has about 600 people in the whole county. The county is probably as large as Delaware. It's a lot of ranch land. King Ranch owns a big part of Kennedy County. Only 600 people. Hurricanes come across there every once in a while. Storm surge is a real issue. But the thing is that there's nobody really living there, especially on the coast. So this service of storm surge protection for any kind of infrastructure doesn't exist because there's no demand for it, right? So you need demand for the service to exist. On the supply side, as I said just a moment ago, there's always the potential supply, right? There's always the potential supply. So thinking back to that Kennedy County with 600 people, if it all of a sudden increased, George Mason University moved in, and now we have an additional 35 or 40,000 people there in Kennedy County. Now we have infrastructure in place. Now we have probably demand for that storm protection service, right? So, but there's always the potential, but it only has service when there's demand for it. Yeah. Good. So this is a little bit linear, but this is the best way for me to think about how we connect our habitats and biophysical features to these constituents of well-being. And this is taken from the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. This hasn't changed in millennia, right? These things that are really important to people: security, material health, social relations. These are all things that time doesn't change. Right? These are all important constituents of well-being. So how do we get from there to the other? And so through this process of ecosystem services, the way I approach it is, okay, the habitats have some biophysical function, whether we're talking about mangrove, marsh, oyster reefs, seagrass, etc. That biophysical function leads into ecological function. So now we need to think about system. One of the things that I've argued over the last couple of years is we need to put systems back in ecosystem services, because we have a tendency, and I'm very much guilty of this, of only thinking of services emanating from a particular biophysical feature: an oyster reef, a seagrass bed, mangrove. But now we really need to think about systems and ecosystem services. We need to put that back in. So we go this biophysical function to ecological function, and that produces these services. So this here is the translation part. So this is where the biophysical and the natural sciences start talking to it. So actually, I should talk before even the project begins, really. But this is where kind of the rubber hits the road, where there's a lot of opportunity to do that translational work between what's happening ecologically to how that turns into a service, and then eventually impacts human well-being, right? So all these potential services impact these constituents of well-being. Now, the thing that we want to talk about today is how we value those constituents of well-being, those services, and then more importantly, what are the policy levers, the management decisions that need to be made that get us back to the beginning in terms of how we deal with our particular systems, habitats, biophysical features. I bring up the idea of this, putting systems back in ecosystem services. And correct me if I'm wrong, but we don't really manage our natural resources by systems. We manage them by a habitat or a particular biophysical feature. So to do that would be a real sea change to actually talk about managing a system. And so in the Gulf of Mexico right now, as a result of the Deepwater Horizon blowout, there is money on the ground now to do restoration projects. There is money forthcoming to do restoration projects. So there's a lot of questions about how all these individual projects that may happen, how would they impact the systems? So one of the things I like to kind of talk about is, you hear this, death to a system or a habitat by 1,000 cuts. Well, what's the equivalent on the other side is death to a system by not coordinated restoration activities, right? So that's what we need to be thinking about as we move forward. And ecosystem services, if we put the system back into ecosystem services, can help inform that a bit. So consider the quality of the service, and this is something that we've been thinking about over the last year or two. Is the recognition, at least from my colleagues and I that do the valuation and then the connection to human well-being, the realization that habitats are not homogeneous. So the example I like to give is marsh. So fragmented marsh versus continuous marsh. So we just look at a couple of different ecosystem services: recreational fishing and storm protection. The fragmented marsh, recreational fishing service, the quality of that is relatively higher than you would have in continuous marsh. There's no doubt that the evidence is out there. The nekton densities along the marsh edge, etc., show that to be the case. The problem is storm protection in this type of an environment is very low compared to storm protection in a continuous marsh environment. So, we have to consider the trade-offs, one, as we're doing restoration work, but we also have to recognize that, we're not talking about homogeneous good. or service, if we want to talk about that, in kind of economic terminology. But when we look at it on a map, we kind of think, okay, it's X number of hectares, it's all the same. Well, in fact, that's not the case. And so recognition of these quality differences is important in the linking the biophysical structure and function more accurately to the provision of the services. So valuing ecosystem services. So how can we express what we value? As I mentioned before, they can be monetary or they can be non-monetary, right? So thumbs up, 1, 2, 4, 8, any kind of scale, red, green, yellow. And as an economist and somebody that practices the valuation of ecosystem services, I'm very cognizant of the difficulty in doing that. So expressing value in monetary terms and doing it well is extremely difficult. And it's also difficult in non-monetary terms, but I think the lift is not as great. So as I talk to others that kind of want to jump right into the deep end and do monetary evaluation, I caution them that to do it right really takes a big effort. It could take several years just on a single project. So NOAA has a series of NER sites, National Estuarine Research Reserves. Some of you may be familiar with those around the country. They recently finished a study at the Wells NER up in Maine, and that project there to look at this issue of kind of riparian habitat and how that impacts water quality and the impact on human well-being. That project in and of itself took about 3 years to do, but they did it right. So the investment was long in terms of the time and the resources that it takes. But that's if you want to get at a monetary value, you need to be able to do it right and you be able to be willing to make that investment. So as we mentioned this before, really ecosystem services fall into 2 broad categories: these market services, business services, and non-market. So market services, things that you can think of: food, raw materials, ornamental resources, etc. Food could be fisheries, commercial fisheries, for example. Raw materials, timber, oil and gas, etc. Ornamental resources. So a lot of this market, it's like going to the store, looking at the can of soup, picking out the characteristics that you like. Do you like the price? Yes, you pay for it. Okay, you move on. The non-market, which is actually more of the services that exist, are much more difficult to get at. Right? Much more difficult to get at. And that's what takes the time and the effort. So I wanted to give you just 2 examples of the work that I've done in valuing ecosystem services. One has to do with oyster reefs, and another has to do with freshwater inflow into estuaries, which is a really important issue along the Gulf Coast. Well, the Western Gulf and the Eastern Gulf, not so much maybe the Middle Gulf, but that's not necessarily the case. But first, this nutrient regulation by oyster reefs. So normally you wouldn't list 4 authors there, right? You'd say Pollock et al. But I did that on purpose because 3 of those are biophysical scientists, right? So I'm the only economist, which was fine. But what I wanted to highlight is that this work that we did was very much a coming together of oyster ecology, estuarine ecologists, and biophysical modeling, right? So, and myself on the economic side. And that's what's needed at the beginning to do really good, solid work, is that coming together early on, and not a sprinkle on of the social science or economic sciences at the end, or the policy sciences at the end, which happens. And quite frankly, to be fair, on the social science side of things, we may do the same with the biophysical side, is sprinkle it on at the end, which is not fair. So this particular project was looking at this idea of one ecosystem services, and that was this idea of nitrogen removal, we might want to call nitrogen nutrient regulation, was really built around nitrogen as a particular nutrient. There's been a lot written about the decline of oysters over time, whether you want to look in the Chesapeake or around the world. Beck et al. Did a really good comprehensive review of this in 2011. but the attempts to value these sorts of services has been very coarse and not very well refined, not very in depth, kind of, you know, at a higher level. And so what we wanted to do here is really dig into the biophysical function in that reef, have a really good, strong understanding of that, and then a good, strong understanding of that potential value. So we consider, as I said, the nitrogen regulation as a function of denitrification, burial, and physical transport, or actually harvest of the oysters, so removal out of the system in the Mission-Aransas estuary. So this is in the coastal bend of Texas. So as that bend in Texas, this estuary is what we're talking about. So once again, I'll go through this really quick. You know, this was our thinking, and the idea was to link one particular service to a constituent of well-being, and that would be this idea not of clean air necessarily, but of clean water. So what can the oysters do to kind of clear up the water, which would make it more attractive for recreational fishing or contact recreation, swimming, boating, etc. So just some of our methods and results. The environmental variables were collected throughout 2007 and 2008 by oyster dredge, randomly selected locations on the reefs in Copano and Aransas Bay. And then we calculated the filtration and the clearance rates. I didn't do that, my natural science colleagues did that. So that's the output that we have there. That was then the input into the valuation of that service. So in order to calculate the cost equivalent of the service of nitrogen removal, we equated it to cost estimates for a constructed biological nutrient removal supplement to a wastewater treatment plant. Okay, so that's not usually the case in the Gulf Coast. We don't have those issues, but those are very relevant here in the Chesapeake Bay, as you well know, right? These add-on BNR processes are very. Now, having said that, this is becoming more and more of an issue. So this idea that eventually we will have to have add-ons to remove nutrients from wastewater, what could be the impact that the oysters could have in helping supplement that? So we're essentially looking at the replacement cost equivalent. So we found that the cost equivalent of that service provided by the oysters in that particular system was almost $30,000 a year. So running through our statistics, running through the biophysical models, calculating that nutrient removal, the live dead ratio. I will say that this is the problem with looking at mapping in 2 dimensions, is that we know the oyster reefs are 3-dimensional, right? But when you look at aerial extent of maps, or aerial extent of oyster reefs on a map, it's 2 dimensions. So we're missing the whole 3-dimensional possibilities of that oyster reef. So actually, this is a conservative number for a number of reasons. One, because we're only measuring oysters in 2 dimensions, not 3, and also because we're only measuring one service and not potential multiple services. The value generated in this study, which was, if you look at it, about $8.3 per kilogram removed of nitrogen, is reasonably similar to various studies that have taken place in North Carolina as well as Chesapeake. Okay, actually more conservative than those studies. What I will say, though, is that this was not what we call a primary evaluation study. Okay, this was taking an existing process, the biological nutrient removal, the cost of that, and then applying that to our case study site. So what the oysters do in the same fashion. There's some critique, there's some criticism of that, of which I have myself. The problem is, if you were to do a primary evaluation study, which means I go out and I ask you and you and you what you value in terms of the removal of nitrogen from the system, it's expensive, and we can't always do that. So the idea here in this study was to create a method that would be transferable from this site to other sites, and that would be a first effort to look at potential value of nutrient removal from oysters. Another study that we did a few years ago was this idea of the value of freshwater inflow. And I was working with Paul and Tanya and I on this project. And this was a primary evaluation study. So an estuary is not an estuary without that mixing of freshwater and marine water, right? I mean, that's what defines an estuary. So what we have a problem with in Texas, especially in the area that we work in, is diminished freshwater inflow because of diversions upstream, because it's just changing climate over time. So the estuaries are potentially changing. So the driving question here is how is that environmental flow really going to impact this ecosystem, and then how does that then impact human well-being? So as I said, availability of water diverted to cities and agriculture, etc., lessens freshwater inflow. So the idea here is that we did was to study two areas, one in our backyard and one down on the border with Mexico in the lower Rio Grande Valley, and assess the value that the public places on freshwater inflow. So environmental flow, freshwater inflow in and of itself is not an ecosystem service, right? So it's that thing it's once removed, but it impacts the biophysical features, the habitats, the system that humans do interact with, right? That they then do have these ecosystem services that they can then value. So for us, the question was, how do you connect environmental flow to services to human well-being? And so that took a lot of work, because as we were going to go into the field and have people take surveys, they needed very clear information on that connection. So necessitated working with Paul and his team to be able to work through those connections. So assessing the value that the public places on freshwater inflow, we use something that's called a stated preference approach. So it's revealed preference would be, you go to the store, you buy that can of soup, you have revealed your preference for that can of soup, right? We can see that, we can measure that. Stated preference relies on you saying what you prefer based upon scenarios that we give you, right? So that's the difference, is that there's no action directly by the individual. We have to pull that action or the preferences through a survey approach. And so participants were given hypothetical scenarios. We trained graduate and undergraduate who surveyed individuals. We had very graphical information. I will say this is important. It looked like a cartoon, but actually this is a little known thing that people really react positively to something like this rather than a highly structured, graphically intense picture, right? I mean, I don't know if it takes you back to your childhood and you're comfortable looking at this or what it is, but just a simple drawn graphic like this is much better than something that's very highly stylized. And then we asked questions to elicit what they would be willing to pay, what they were actually willing to donate to protect freshwater inflow. So actually in Texas, what you can do is you can buy water. Right? You can buy water rights. You can take those water rights, deposit them into the Texas Water Trust, and they will be protected forever. They can't be used for anything else. So there was a very real mechanism to protect these water rights. So not so hypothetical. As I said, this is, Copano Bay, San Antonio Bay, so this is in the coastal bend, once again, of Texas. And then we also surveyed down on the Mexican border in the lower Rio Grande Valley. Interviewed 417 individuals in Rio Grande Valley and 499 in the San Antonio Bay region. So we just missed that one person, they hit 500. So as interesting as the values, monetary values generated, really are the descriptive statistics that come out from work like this. So knowledge of regions and wetlands and marshes, so those that we surveyed, really majority of them knew very little or nothing about that. Were they a member of conservation or environmental group? Most of them were not. Were they a Texas resident? Most of them were, but why this was an important question is because at the time that we were surveying, we get a lot of what's called winter Texas, people coming down from just about everywhere else, right? So, you know, how much do they use the resources of the natural environment? So we want to make sure we captured that. And do they recreate in the area? The overwhelming majority did. That was the purpose. We wanted to make sure that we got at those recreations. How many, now this is really important as you're going through the process, and why I want to get into deep in the weeds a little bit is because, you know, how do humans behave? You know, how do humans think? A lot of time what I talk about is that social sciences are the harder sciences because we have to deal with humans, right? And that's, we all have different opinions, we all have different behaviors. You know, we're not mullet all swimming in the same direction, right? So it's a harder science, and getting an understanding of people's behavior patterns, you want to check and recheck. So how many were willing to make this one-time donation to protect water rights? Overwhelming majority. How sure were they on a scale of 1 to 10? Well, most of them were pretty sure. Anything above 7 would say, yeah, you're really pretty sure you're going to donate. What do they think about their neighbors, though? Well, most of them thought that their neighbors would not donate. So 1% of all Texas households, how many are they going to make a one-time donation? Overwhelming majority said probably not at all. So they thought really highly of themselves. I'm going to make a donation, but I don't think my neighbors are probably going to do that. So that's an interesting observation. And finally, we took all this information, we ran them through the willingness to pay scenario, we did the statistical modeling, and what we came out with was a mean willingness to pay per household at that point in time, and this is right before the Great Recession. This is right before the Great Recession. $129 in the Rio Grande Valley and $124 in San Antonio Bay region. Okay. Now, if we would have done that study 2 years later, those numbers would probably be very different. Okay. So what's the value of doing this? Well, then we summed it up over the relevant households, almost 10 million here, almost 5.5 million here. So why do that study, and why get a dollar amount? Well, what it was, believe it or not, was actually, unbeknownst to us, very much a marketing study for a few of the NGOs that their goal was to protect water rights in the Rio Grande River, Lower Rio Grande River, and in the Guadalupe, San Antonio River basin. So they saw that, hey, people are willing to separate themselves from their hard-earned money. They said so. This is great information from us. Now we have something we can stand on to kind of go after, garner more monies, and then begin to protect water rights. So finally here, some policy to application, or what did I say, policy and application, right? So the practice to the policy. So what are some of the keys to success as I see it in the work that I've done in my academic career and in my short time now at NOAA? Do I see moving forward? And remember, I'm talking from a very kind of coastal marine focus, so I'm not really dealing with terrestrial environments, so just keeping that in mind. I think this is a no-brainer. More explicit ties to policy and decision at the beginning of the ecosystem service projects that you might do. One that's going to obviously engage a whole group of people that you wouldn't have thought of before that could have resources to fund those projects, right? And then your project becomes policy relevant. Your project becomes policy relevant. So knowing the issues, knowing the policy context, the management issues, and working that in at the beginning of the project is one of the keys to success of when we practice policy. Consider the full ecosystem services spectrum. I mean, I can't, hopefully in demonstration of the work that I do and what I've talked about so far, I can't talk about this enough, and that is very much that connection between the biophysical and the social sciences, right? That needs to happen at the beginning, it needs to happen continuously. That is not the case in a lot of the work that's being done currently in terms of the academic work or even the work within the agencies. There's great opportunity to have that work done, and I think we're kind of right on the cusp of that. You know, I think you hear enough of the preaching, not only from myself, but from other people, saying we need to do this. I think that people are understanding that we need to have that explicit connection. But what you need to do is you need to incentivize that. And you need to incentivize the biophysical and the social sciences working on from the beginning. NSF has started to do that. I think they're still far behind, but the agencies themselves, the science and resource management agencies themselves, can kind of really jump on that bandwagon and get that moving quickly. Measure changes in ecosystem services. It's not a static value, right? I mean, we don't take well, most cases, we don't take biophysical measurements just once. Monitoring programs are observing programs and systems are set up to monitor continuously or at some appropriate time step. Why don't we do that with ecosystem services values, socioeconomic values in general? Okay, so measuring as we measure changes in the environment, changes in the biophysical system, let's kind of get those concomitant changes in ecosystem service values as well. And communication engagement is critical. I mean, you hear this a lot, but the communication engagement, internally to agencies, externally to the public at large, to leadership, continuously, engaging those individuals and letting them know how this value-added process of actually connecting biophysical research to social science research, ecosystem services can actually be value-added to the work of the agencies. Let me just talk a little bit about some policy tools. What are some sticks and carrots? Regulations, NERDA, Magnuson-Stevenson. For those of you that don't know what NERDA, Natural Resources Damage Assessment Process. This came about after Exxon Valdez, the Ocean Oil Pollution Act. Magnuson-Stevenson, that's what manages our nation's fisheries, right? Very, very scripted, very prescriptive on what you need to do. So is there room in ecosystem services to fit in there? Yes, there is. Enabling legislation such as NEPA, Coastal Zone Management Act, Endangered Species Act, Fish and Wildlife Coordination Act, and WRDA, which is the Water Resources Development Act, and principles and requirements or principles and guidelines. Yes, there's space in there as well. So I want to talk about one right now. We can, have maybe discussion on the other in a little bit, and the principles and requirements. This is the last time this was updated was in 1983. It last got signed off by the White House, the Council on Environmental Quality, the updated version last year in 2013. Okay, so it's 1983 to 2013. There hadn't been any change in how we assess federal investment in water projects. Now, what do I mean by water projects? Well, that covers the gamut. You want to build a dam, you want to dredge a canal, you want to restore marsh, you want to build barrier islands. Those all fall under principles and guidelines, principles and requirements. So no updates since 1983. The biggest change in this, a significant change in this, is the following. Now, I've kind of picked pieces here and put them together. The evaluation methods should, so you evaluate projects, right, that fall under this, should apply an ecosystem services approach in order to appropriately capture all effects, capture all those benefits, economic, environmental, and social, associated with potential federal water resources investment. This is a tremendous change because how work was done before under principles and guidelines, the principles and requirements, was the traditional economic impact. How many jobs created? What's the potential of that dam and the water now stored behind it to impact agriculture? That the environment in an ecosystem services lens was not captured at all. So this is a really big change. The problem is with that and any of the other NEPA, Coastal Zone Management Act, etc., is that things have been done a certain way for a long time, right? And you can't turn that ship on a dime, right? So what we have seen now is that there's actually, very specifically with the principles and guidelines or requirements I just talked about, there's actually been some roadblocks that have been put in place to stop that type of analysis taking place. In fact, there was Congress put this rider onto a bill that said, thou shalt not, Army Corps, thou shalt not do any of this work. Shall not evaluate projects using an ecosystem services approach. Okay, so for the moment now, there's been kind of this cease and desist order. Hopefully over time we'll get past that. But that would be a tremendous change. The thing that scares me about that is that there's really limited resources and capacity to be able to do that work. So economists, sociologists, anthropologists that do the work that I do are interested in the work that I'm interested in. There's very few of us compared to the potential work that could be out there. So while we have this mandate and these new requirements, who's going to do the work? Not just within the federal agencies, but academics that you might contract with, consultants that you might contract, the capacity just isn't there. So we need to think about building that capacity over time. And then there are some, perceived methodological challenges. I mean, valuing ecosystem services. Yeah, I have a problem with that, some people might say. So what we need to get past is these issues of these perceived methodological problems. And some of you may remember after Exxon Valdez, there was a lot of controversy around what they call the contingent valuation method. NOAA put together a blue ribbon panel to kind of get past that argument, right? Kind of sell it once for all. So what we're thinking of, okay, we need to have a blue ribbon panel too. It's been 20 years since that last blue ribbon panel. Then we need to have another blue ribbon panel to kind of bring this, to kind of settle some of these perceived issues. So just some final thoughts here. I've said this before, this is, for me, this is the constituency. The grandmothers, the next door neighbors, being able to communicate the value of the natural resources that we have and how it impacts human well-being, to be able to convince them. I mean, this one, her in the middle, if you can convince her, right? My next door neighbor knows nothing about what the marsh along the coast, how it benefits her, right? How can I communicate that to her? Well, ecosystem services are a way to do that, right? Now, I wouldn't get into the nitty-gritty of it, but for her to know the storm protection potential of that marsh, the benefits of pollutant attenuation, right? So, in fact, it may be a benefit to her because maybe her tax bill doesn't increase for additional BNR processing on the wastewater treatment plant, or her flood insurance rates don't go up because we have marsh out there to, dampen storm surge protection. So communicating it is extremely important. And then kind of finally bringing all this together, I need to update this table. It's a little dated in terms of its look more than anything, but it's really this idea of environmental decision making is not the domain of one discipline. So there's the social and cultural considerations, political and policy realities, the economics, and then the natural sciences. So we need to keep that in mind. Kind of going back to how we started the lecture, we need to include all the benefits and costs. So if we're not capturing those benefits of the natural environment in a way that the developer of that new marina is going to talk about benefits of his or her project, then we're selling the environment short. So all I'm saying is let's play on the same field. Okay, and so including those benefits are really important. Right now, in a lot of the decision making that happens at a very local level, and that's a lot of land use, land management decisions are local or state, controlled. Right now, that benefits of the environment aren't included in that decision making process. Thank you.
So we have time for some questions, and just so you know, we have about 10 folks online as well, and so if they have questions, we hope they'll type them in, and we'll read them out for you as well. So, Bob.
Yeah, one technical question. You're valuing against BNR. What do you mean by BNR?
Okay, so what we did, yeah, because there's different processes. Right?
Well, different, maybe same result process, but different approaches to doing it.
Yes. So what we did was, and I didn't share this, is we took a very specific. We took the backwater facility in, I guess it's in Maryland, and the cost of their BNR supplement to their wastewater treatment, and we used that very specific process.
So a teaching moment for everybody here. So this is really stimulating denitrification. What happened in Maryland was a system using the organic wastewater fuel to denitrify. as opposed to what's happening at Blue Plains here, is they're feeding them alcohol. They're feeding them methanol to drive denitrification. It's a much more expensive process.
Yeah.
But they're big and they're gigantic.
Yeah.
And that's why, so in terms of your valuation.
Yeah, it was very specific to that one wastewater treatment facility. I hope that answered the question.
Yeah.
Yeah, but you're right, there's many ways to do it, absolutely. So policy questions, I mean, good.
I just have a question. I thought it was interesting or scary that you mentioned how the Army Corps of Engineers is actively trying to stop these evaluations. Is there a...
No, I should. So
Put your HRI hat on first.
okay, yeah. So NOAA hat coming off, HRI hat coming on. No, if I said it like that, I mischaracterized it. The issue is, so Army Corps, in terms of projects that would fall under principles and requirements, most of them would fall in the Army Corps' basket in terms of coastal issues. And so what happened is, and I don't know how it came about, but there was concern about how to move out on incorporating ecosystem services into this benefit cost calculations. And so, and I don't know what bill it was just in this conversation with an individual at the Army Corps had said that, no, and we have the cease and desist order essentially because of this rider that was put onto a bill in Congress. So there are some individuals within the Corps that would like to do this. I imagine there probably are some that are not. I don't know, but that's the reality now, is that it's going to be very difficult to move out on that until that all gets settled. And it's a huge change. It's a huge change in the way that the benefits and costs are calculated. So, and we've been doing the same way since 1983. So I could understand the hesitancy. Yeah, I don't.
I think you said you didn't always have to put the monetary values on the ecosystem services. There's some that you can't. But when you're talking with those who have impact on policy, do you find it easier when you can say a monetary value? Because I'm coming from Savannah, Georgia, where there is a major topic of being the harbor, and I can think of one major potential impact on human health that would be resulted if they do deepen it. Yeah. But yet, I don't know if there's a way to put a monetary value on that damage. And so I'm just wondering, do you find monetary value easier to get across to policymakers versus a non-monetary?
I would say not just policymakers. I would say policymakers, NGOs, city government, county governments. I mean, I think there's a real desire to put a monetary value on services, right? Because then you can hold it up and compare it against what other options there are, right? So it's easy, seemingly easy to do that. But as I said earlier, I'm very cognizant of the difficulty in doing that, doing it right. There's a lot of wrong ways to put monetary values on things, and a lot of that kind of work is being done. We need to be able to do it the right way, and that's difficult, and it takes time. But that's the way it should be. So, but you said something about kind of health issues, and so I think this is really important, because this is kind of a new thing. I shouldn't say new, but this is a new way of looking at how you can link biophysical changes to ecosystem services to kind of community environmental health impacts. And so there's kind of some ginning up in that area now.
Well, the example I'm thinking of directly is, one concern is that if they deepen the harbor by about 4 to 8 feet, is what they're trying to do, is that the aquifer in the area comes really close to the surface, to the point where the concern is that if they deepen it, but they shall make it too shallow, the water is not going to go through enough soil, dirt and everything to properly clean it before it gets to the aquifer. And I don't know if I'm thinking, I don't know if I'm correct to that being an ecosystem service, but I was thinking of the cleaning the water.
Well, water supply is right. So if that eventually gets used by because somebody's pulling out groundwater for and they expect it to be potable, right, and it's not, then there's some concerns there.
Yes, and there's a lot of concern about like saltwater intrusion and
Sure.
other things
Yep.
that would be getting removed from the water, getting
Yeah.
into the aquifer if they make it too shallow.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you for the presentation. I was meeting a few weeks ago with some folks from the energy utility sector, and they're freaked by the concept of services. They're afraid that, are you endangered species access for the last period of time? Now you're going to put more requirements on our lands and things like that. And I'm just trying to convey the idea that one of the ecosystem services is you may be able to monetize some of the services and help on your lands and the properties and things like that. There's a nervousness about that. Like, am I going to get more regulated?
Yeah.
There's more risk downside than upside to this.
Yeah.
And so I was curious what your thoughts are about this as a policy tool and its potentially coming on a private sector.
So where I've engaged with the private sector has been, as you can imagine, in the Gulf, in the oil and gas industry. And there's some caution there, but I think where they see value is actually in some of the kind of environmental assessment work that they already do. Is characterizing ecosystem services, but it's not explicitly expressed as ecosystem services. So they see kind of as a first step, right? They say as a first step is, okay, what we do is kind of assessing ecosystem services. We just don't call it that. So what we now need to do is start translating what we do into the ecosystem services, because this is what people are talking about. So for them, that's a first step. But they also, as you said, I mean, so who's the largest private wetland owner, coastal wetland owner in the United States? ConocoPhillips, private, ConocoPhillips, right? So there's real value in those wetlands, right, beyond what might be extracted out of it. So proving up that value, as you were saying, in potential other benefits, could change their thinking about how they manage those resources. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, it's ongoing.
It's ongoing.
Challenge, so,
Yeah.
I appreciate your input. Definitely in that particular example. How do we turn it around in a way that they can benefit from, from, hey, we've got all this land, we're not turning it all into shopping malls. Right?
So one of the things that we're moving out on over the next year and a half is a strategic objective within the Department of Commerce is to have these series of natural capital roundtables around the country that brings in kind of the industry cluster for a particular region. So in the Gulf, it might be oil and gas. It talks about how they can integrate natural capital into their decision-making calculus, whatever it might be for whatever particular product. So that's going to be happening over the next year and a half. There was.
So this might be a question that you might want to answer afterwards, but I don't know. So I'm a graduate student studying environmental sustainability, and I was wondering if you could think of a career in there, in the environmental, in ecosystem services future that I could do with with writing, having to do with writing. Like, I know you mentioned communication to the public was really important.
Right. So your degree is environmental sustainability?
Environmental sustainability, but I really enjoy writing. That's one of my main abilities. So,
well, you want to talk about this after?
Sure.
Yeah, that way we, So
Great.
I'd be happy to talk to you.
Great.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I do some valuation work, but I'm becoming more skeptical of the end result being that ecosystem service valuation is going to be embedded in any sort of damage assessment process. And part of that is just, habitat equivalency analysis is an easier process that fits really well with existing compensatory programs like wetland banking. But also the cost of engaging in these exercises is really, really high. I mean, I have a buddy who's working as a contractor for NOAA now. He's involved in convening all these John lists all these economists every once in a while. They're getting paid a fortune to talk about the method, the theoretical details behind contingent valuation. And it doesn't seem to me that in the end, it was really worth, the Blue Ribbon panel was great. It set out a huge field of research, but in terms of what it accomplished for compensation for the Exxon Valdez spill, in the end, it was practically nothing because the Supreme Court knocked everything down. And so, to me, it seems that the legal standing of HEA is much stronger. And especially when you get into things like, okay, what should the baseline be for damage assessment of the Deepwater Horizon? I mean, we have a situation where a huge number of people were displaced from Louisiana.
Yeah, we have a tremendous shifting,
Katrina,
changing baselines.
And so now we have, if Katrina hadn't hit, presumably the damages would have been much more significant because there would be more people down there in the region. How do you deal with things like reputation effects in terms of impacts on tourism or even seafood? Because it's not clear legally, how do you, is it okay to charge? I mean, would that be appropriate to charge the responsible party for those sorts of impacts? And I guess where I really see the ecosystem, where I've seen this whole idea of ecosystem services be successful is when you're moving beyond the whole stated preference process to actually market transactions between private parties and public. So, for instance, payments for ecosystem services. It seems to me that that's really where the rubber hits the road, and you're allowing individuals to come up with their own valuations and then perhaps engage in private transactions. And I think, new technology would be really effective in smoothing that and perhaps completely negate the need for future ecosystem service valuation efforts.
Well, yeah.
I'm coming from someone who does this stuff too.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, it's difficult, and monetizing them incorrectly is very difficult. As I said before, there's a lot of sloppy work out there, mainly in the benefit transfer area, that they don't take it far enough. And there's one group in particular, which I'm not going to name here, that just produces these outrageous numbers that make no sense because they don't want to do the value-added work. So the thing is, the problem with ecosystem services right now, I think we're at this tipping point. We can kind of continue what we're doing and risk damaging the reputation of the work that's going on, or we can actually take it to the next level and start doing some really better science behind the services. And I don't know. It's easy to do the benefit transfer stuff. It's more difficult to do the primary valuation stuff. The payments for ecosystem services, yes, where there are certain services that you can. So maybe water supply, maybe maybe storm protection, storm surge protection. Maybe there's just a handful of those services. But then there's all the rest as well. So we just kind of. Yeah.
Might be a longer conversation.
It might be a longer conversation.
Yeah.
Over dinner. Yeah. Okay.
So,
one more?
Sure. Yeah.
I was wondering if you could explain more about the water rights laws in Texas. I've heard of these before, but I'm not sure. I know that the issue of water supply in those states pertaining to agriculture. Florida was an issue, so we did great work to support a lot of floods. And now in California and Arizona, there's been a lot of issues with rainwater. So is that a similar case in Texas with agriculture?
Oh, well, geez, we could spend a lot of time on that. Okay, so the short and sweet answer is that water rights in Texas, that's in most Western states, are quasi-private. When I say quasi-private, it's because really the state, by definition, holds water in trust. So that's why you have a right to use it. So that right is fungible, right? You can sell it, you can trade it, you can do whatever with it. And it's based on acre feet. So 1 acre foot is about 323,000 gallons, something like that. So the law in Texas says if you don't put that water and water right to beneficial use, you have the possibility of it being canceled. So you have to put it to beneficial use within a 10-year time frame. It's never been challenged at all. There's never been, to my knowledge, a cancellation of a water right. But in order to protect water right, they set up this Texas Water Trust. So I just want to buy water, leave it in the system. Do nothing with it. Don't use it for municipal, don't use it for ag, just leave it in the system. Let it flow to the coast. So the Texas Water Trust was set up to be able to do that. I buy an acre foot, I put it in the water trust, nobody can touch it forever, right? The problem also is that the water has been over allocated, right? In the good times, there was plenty of water for everybody. We didn't really have to worry about it. Now times are changing. Cities are growing up. Ag is, still using a fair amount of water, and the climate's changing. There's less rainfall, right? So now there's a big scramble. Oh, I have a right. I have a right. Wait a minute. We don't have enough water for all the rights. Now, how do we distribute those rights when there's not enough water on those systems? The systems are allocated. And I could continue on. We have the old English common law system and the riparian systems by the Spaniards, and I don't want to even go into that. And so that's the issue as well. So I kind of put a lot there in a short amount of time. Did it answer anything that you? I thought the answer was great, but I don't know if you. I have a whole dissertation on it. I'll hand over to you.
It sounds like we had a couple of questions from the Google Hangout. No,
There are none. Yeah.
There are none?
No.
No.
Right, so before we thank our speaker, I have a couple of announcements to make. Next week, we will have another seminar in this room. No, it's not in this room. I'll send up the seminar info, but it'll be at the same time. It's Bob Christian from East Carolina University, and he's going to talk to us about viewing ecosystems as a network of networks. There is another talk on campus at 4:30 in the AOES department by Robert Hazen on mineral ecology, and that's over in Exploratory Hall next to the geology display. And we will be going to dinner with David after this at Saba. Is that the name of the restaurant?
Yeah.
Okay, so if you're interested in joining us for that, that would be wonderful. And so with that, I would like to thank you one more time for your time. And
I was fine.
Excellent.